Okay, I hope everyone can see me all right, and I hope the audio is good. So here we are on the 4th of July, and I think it's important that we reflect on the actual meaning of this day, what it is for us and what it is meant for our species, not our race, our species, the human species, what it is meant for the history of our species, the history of mankind. It is a profound celebration that we're engaged in. Now, I just want to mention that yesterday, President Donald Trump gave a speech at Mount Rushmore. And if any of you have not watched that speech in its entirety, you can watch the whole celebration, but if you've not watched the speech itself, I would really encourage you to do so. It was, in my opinion, a great speech, one of the best speeches given by an American president in a long, long time. And it wasn't just a speech. It was very clear that President Trump was speaking from the heart, and what he enunciated was a determination to fight for and to defend what the United States has been and what the founding intention and principles of the United States are. So that's available on YouTube. Anyone can find it. So to sort of preface the historical discussion, because I don't want to turn this into a just an academic rendition of history. The first thing we have to do is to locate the where we are today, where we are in history. We are obviously in a very serious crisis in our nation and worldwide, in nations all over the world. We have an escalating coup against President Donald Trump, one which is intensifying as we move closer and closer toward the November election. One of the aspects of this, as people have seen, is the effort to portray Trump as a racist and essentially to throw the United States into a chaotic type of social confrontation around the issue of race and the United States and what the country is all about, et cetera, et cetera. But look, we saw the vote of the House of Representatives to impeach Trump. We've seen the Christopher Steele, Robert Mueller operation. We've seen the intention of the British House of Lords and the British financial establishment to remove Trump from office. This is going to intensify. For instance, as I said, in regard to the speech that Trump gave yesterday at Mount Rushmore, this morning I went on the internet and I looked at several news publications, and every news publication, their webpage, every news publication I looked at had the same article on Trump's speech, same exact article. It was from Associated Press. So clearly media outlets, mass media outlets around the country are all picking up this article and running it. And the title of the article, I don't have it in front of me, but the title of the article was something like, Trump pushes racial division at Mount Rushmore, violates violates pandemic safety rules or something like that. I mean, just a lying, despicable piece of crap, which they put out. And I don't think we should be surprised by this. Certainly, I'm not surprised by it. But this is going to intensify. Now, in the course of what the LaRouche PAC is doing and what the Schiller Institute is doing, I think it is extremely important that we are very clear in our own minds as to what the United States is, what it was founded to do, what the mission of our nation has been since 1776, really since 1775. I called it in my article the idea of America. You could call it the ideal of America. You could, you don't want to put a label on it, but this underlying moral and philosophical intention of our nation, and that this is what we are fighting for today in the United States. This is what we have to return the nation to be. So I'm going to go through some of what is some of the material contained in my most recent article, which I think was published 2 weeks ago, if I'm not mistaken, or a week ago. In that article, I deal with a number of things, but I'm going to limit it today to 3 topics, and it's going to, or 3 subtopics, and it's going to, it's not going to cover everything that was in the article by any means, but to just sort of lay some of this stuff out. First, I want to talk about the question of slavery itself. Secondly, the Pilgrims. And third, the anti-slavery character of the American Revolution. Now, in my article, I also spend a bit of time talking about William Jay. I'm not going to go into that much in my presentation. If there are questions about it or discussion about it, we can certainly take it up. But I will say just this about William Jay. He was one of the most important of the anti-slavery leaders in the United States in the period, say, from 1820 to 1850. He was unwavering in the fight that he was engaged in. William Jay was the son of John Jay, one of George Washington's closest associates. And John Jay himself had been the founder and president of the first abolition society in the United States, among other things. William Jay's brother was a man named Peter Augustus Jay, and he became the president, I believe in the 1820s, of the Erie Canal Commission, at fighting to use the Erie Canal as a way of spreading the American Revolution into the Great Lakes region, into the Midwest, bringing those areas into the United States as new states, as free states. So this is the Jay family, and it's quite a, it's something that is, well, they were, I'm sort of lost for words. They were, remarkable and great in what they did. So look, why don't I just jump right into it rather than continue with that introduction. Look, I want to talk about slavery because look, what's being said today, it's not just the people tearing down the statues. It's not just the social justice warriors. It's not just Ocasio-Cortez or whatever her name is. These people are lunatics. But it's what's pushed day in and day out in the media, the mass media, on the internet, everywhere. It's what our children and grandchildren are taught in school, which is essentially that from the very beginning, the United States of America was a racist country founded by racists and slave owners, that all we did was enslave people and carry out genocide against the Native American population, and that there was nothing good about the United States from the very beginning. That this is a history that we should be ashamed of, that we should atone for, that we should apologize for, that we should take a knee for. Now, look, I could say that this is, the Joseph Goebbels' big lie, but that's a phrase that's overused, sort of bounces off people. So I'll just put it in my own words, which is that, there is nothing truthful about any of that. Nothing. It's not that you can say, well, yes, America was founded on great principles. All men are created equal, that we had some great leaders, but we did some bad things. You don't have to qualify it. There's nothing to qualify. This idea that America came from slavery, racism, genocide, there is not a word of truth in it. None of it is true. It's completely false. And people should not feel queasy or feel defensive about defending the founding of this country. The founding of this country was one of the greatest events in the history of the human species. So to get back to the question of slavery, I go through this in the article. I won't keep mentioning the article, but the slavery is an institution which has existed throughout all of recorded human history, going back to 5,000 BC, 6,000 BC, and certainly since it existed then, it went back to before recorded human history. Throughout, up until the American Revolution, slavery was universal, everywhere in the world, everywhere, in China, in India, in Europe, in Africa. As I said in the article, well, I mentioned the article again, the slavery existed in Africa before the Spanish and the Portuguese began taking slaves out of Africa. It was widespread in Africa. It was widespread in North America and South America and the Caribbean. Almost all of the Native American tribes held slaves. The worst example is probably the Aztecs, who had brutal slavery. Their general practice was that the Aztecs were sort of like, they sort of developed in a way similar to the Roman Empire, which is they started out as a small tribe, and then they just began conquering one after another of the neighboring tribes and grew bigger and bigger and bigger. And what they did when they conquered these tribes is they killed all of the adult men and enslaved everyone else. In other words, when they conquered a tribe, they didn't just take over their territory, they enslaved all of the surviving members of those tribes. But other tribes throughout North and South America were perhaps not as gruesomely brutal as the Aztecs, but slavery was universal. For instance, look, I'll give you one example from much later on. One of the incidents in American history, one of the perhaps worst incidents in American history, was when Andrew Jackson expelled the Cherokee from the southeast part of the United States, Tennessee and other areas, and sent them on the Trail of Tears. And a lot of people are familiar with this. And an extremely large percentage of these Cherokee and other tribes that were with them died in this trek out to the out to Oklahoma or wherever they went. But what people don't know is that when the Cherokee left, when they were expelled and when they left on this march, they took thousands of black slaves with them, thousands of them. And probably a lot of them died in the Trail of Tears. But the Cherokees nation was a very large slave-owning nation. And I'm not saying this to condemn them or to justify what Andrew Jackson did, but this was the reality. When Christopher Columbus landed in the New World, there were enormous amounts of slaves already here. We did not bring slavery to the New World. So what you're really dealing with in slavery is you're dealing with the question of oligarchical systems which have ruled over most of mankind since before recorded history. Lyndon LaRouche has gone through this many, many times in his writings, that if you look at the history of the human species, what you're looking at up until the American Revolution is a global array of cultures and societies which were ruled by oligarchies, in which the overwhelming majority of the population were subjected to either slavery or de facto slavery, to the condition of being cattle or farm animals for the use of the oligarchy. And that has been the condition of the human species until modern times. That's the reality. For instance, we like to point to, great things in human history in our past. Take, for instance, the question of Plato and Socrates. And as we all know, the real creative tradition in Western European culture that insisted upon the creative ability of the individual human mind to make discoveries, that a lot of this comes out of Plato, flows from Plato. But if you go back to that time, to the Athens of Plato and Socrates, well, while Plato was engaged in his dialogues, more than half the population of Athens were slaves, over half of them. If you fast forward to the Renaissance, and if you read the writings of someone like Machiavelli, Machiavelli is the bitter enemy of oligarchy. And he writes about the problem of oligarchical states. And this was the reality. This was the reality. We were trapped. The human species was trapped within oligarchical systems. Now, that all changed. That all changed. But before I get to that, let me just say a little bit more about slavery. Again, on this question of America being a racist society, how did the slaves get here? How did the slaves get to the New World? Well, you had the transatlantic slave trade. This began in the 16th century, first with the Spanish and then the Portuguese. The Portuguese quickly became the biggest slave trading nation. In the 17th century, they were sort of supplanted by the Dutch, and particularly after 1648, but even earlier, I mean, the Dutch actually sent warships to the coast of Africa, the west coast of Africa, and conquered and seized most of the Portuguese trading posts, slave trading posts, and took them over. And the Portuguese then engaged in massive slave trading. And in the 18th century, they were supplanted by the British. And particularly after 1713, the British became the greatest slave trading empire in human history. Of all of the slaves taken out of Africa over a 300-year period, in less than 100 years, far less than 100 years, the British took more than half of those slaves out of Africa. They were the slave trading empire par excellence. Now, what can you say about this operation? Well, you have the Spanish Empire, the Portuguese Empire, the Dutch Empire, the British Empire. These were empires. These were empires bringing these slaves over. And they were not the first imperial systems to do that. Look, it's estimated, no one knows how many slaves came across in the transatlantic slave trade. You know, the generally accepted estimate is somewhere between 10 and 12 million. I've seen lower, I've seen higher estimates, but generally what is said is that there were about 10 to 12 million slaves taken out of Africa by the Europeans. But prior to that, and even continuing during that period, the Islamic and Arab world had a much more long-standing slave trading operation, and most, again, the figures are partially guesses, but not entirely guesses. But it's estimated that the Arabs and the Islamic states, over about an 800-year period, took somewhere between 15 and 17 million black slaves out of Africa. And they took them out through the Mediterranean, through the Red Sea, off the East Coast. And this went on for centuries and centuries and centuries. And, you know, this was not, none of this was unique or anything like that. Maybe the magnitude of it was unique. But this was going on, as I said, everywhere in the world this was going on. In terms of the slavery in the New World, as I said, about 10 to 12 million slaves were brought into the New World by these empires. But out of this 10 to 12 million slaves, only about 380,000 of them were brought into the 13 colonies. You know, people have the idea that, you know, slavery has something unique to do with the 13 colonies and the founding of the United States. Only 380,000 of the slaves brought into the New World went to the colonies, which is only about 3%. 97% of the slaves went to Mexico, the Caribbean, South America. The Portuguese colony of Brazil was one of the biggest recipients of slaves. And then as you get into the late 17th and early 18th century, you get the development of the giant sugar plantations in the Caribbean. And these were, this is where a large number of slaves went. These areas, it was particularly brutal. The average life expectancy of a slave on a sugar plantation in the Caribbean was only about 5 years. They were just worked to death, and then they would bring more slaves in. You know, at that time, it was cheaper to bring in more slaves than it was to pay to keep these people alive. And what was developed from Mexico through the Caribbean, all the way down through South America, what was developed was an imperial slave labor economy. This wasn't slavery just for the sense of, you know, we're superior and we want to have slaves. It was a slave labor economic system. And it was used to finance and prop up these empires. The British operation, the money from the slave trade went into the Royal Africa Company. It went into the London stock market. It went into the Bank of England. All empires are financial empires, all of them. And this is particularly true. It's true in general, but it's particularly true of this Anglo-Dutch model of empire, where you have a financial oligarchy, financial markets, and where the warships and the armies of that empire are there to enforce the extraction of loot, which then finances the financial operations of that empire. And what they created was a gigantic, massive slave labor economy from the Caribbean down through South America. Now, what the British decided to do after about 1650, 1660, and then it went into really high gear in the 18th century, was to import their slave labor economic model from the Caribbean, where the British had a lot of slave plantations, sugar plantations, Barbados, Antigua, Jamaica, a lot of places, to import that model into the 13 colonies, to bring the slave labor model into the 13 colonies. That was done based on decisions that were made in London. That was done by the financial oligarchy and the monarchy and the aristocracy of the British Empire. And they began to do that. And they began to ship large numbers of slaves into the colonies. One of the things they did, particularly under the Royal Africa Company, was to attempt to turn New York City into the slave trading hub of the 13 colonies. And the colonies resisted. They resisted. Colony after colony after colony passed laws prohibiting the importation of slaves, or restricting the importation of slaves, or in different ways trying to limit or restrict or stop this flood of slaves that the British were bringing in. Now, I'll give you one quote here. I mean, a number of these states passed similar laws, and all the laws that they passed were nullified in London by the king himself, or by the Board of Trade, or other agencies in London, the Privy Council, etc. But I'll read you one thing. In 1772, now this is only 4 years before the Declaration of Independence. In 1772, the Assembly of Virginia passed a law to stop the importation of slaves. Now this is Virginia. You know, this is what people think of as the Confederacy, a slave-owning state. But in 1772, they passed a law to stop the importation of slaves. This was sent to London, and it was immediately nullified, overturned by the king. And the king sent back a message, and I'll read you a short quote from his message. This is from King George III. He says, "Upon pain of his highest displeasure, the importation of slaves should not be in any respect obstructed." So this is coming directly from the British monarchy. This is what they were doing. And this is, in fact, what the colonies revolted against in 1775. Not on the, limited issue of black slavery per se, but on the clear intention of the British imperial rulers to essentially reduce everyone in the colonies to de facto slavery, to impose a slave labor economy on the colonies, and to destroy the economic development of these colonies, to prevent it. Because, I mean, we've talked about other things that were done at that time, stopping westward expansion, stopping the colonies from manufacturing. This is all part of the same thing. And if you have a slave labor economic system, where does that leave the white colonists who are not slaves? What is their existence going to be in a slave labor economy? It's going to be reduced to essentially living on the margins of existence. Their labor is not going to be worth anything because how can you compete with slave labor? So this is what was revolted against in 1775. And at that time, the question of slavery itself was seen clearly by the leaders of the American Revolution as an essential part of that revolution. There's people, even, people who sort of might agree with a lot of what I'm saying. There's a problem in people's minds sometimes where they tend to differentiate these two things. They'll say like, well, Alexander Hamilton developed, what some people call today the American system of economics. And then there was the question of slavery, and that these were somehow separate issues. Well, they weren't separate issues in Hamilton's mind. They weren't separate issues in the mind of Ben Franklin or George Washington or John Jay or Gouverneur Morris, certainly not in Hamilton's mind. Look, Hamilton was the co-founder of the Abolition Society in New York. He founded it with John Jay. Jay became the president, Hamilton became the secretary. I've read a lot of Hamilton's writings, including his articles, his speeches, his letters. And throughout his entire career, going back to before the American Revolution, when he was a teenager, all the way through to the day he died, he was passionately anti-slavery. And this wasn't just, a separate moral commitment. Oh, we're against slavery. It's horrible. It's inhuman. It was inseparable from his economic proposals and economic policies. The credit system he developed, the national banking system he developed. This was all intended to create a nation of free labor, of economic progress, of human invention. And it's inseparable from the question of ending slavery, of creating an entirely new type of society, an anti-oligarchical society. That was the intention. And I sort of cringe when I hear people sort of reduce the importance of the American Revolution or Hamilton to simply economic policies. Every now and then someone sort of says, well, the best thing about the American Revolution or America was we developed the American system of economics. I mean, I really cringe when I hear that, because it misses what this nation really is. You had an intention to develop an anti-oligarchical society, a society based, a society within which individual human beings could realize their potential for creativity, for reason, where science and industry would be encouraged, where progress would be fostered, from generation to generation. And it is within that intention that the genius of Alexander Hamilton developed his banking and credit policies, which then made that intention, embedded that intention into the economic policies of the nation. But the intention comes first. And what was done in the United States with the American Revolution had never been done anywhere before in history. I think I'm going to take this a little out of order because or the order that I had planned, because I want to continue with this just a little bit. Look, as I said, well, what happens with the revolution? Hold on. Try to keep my place here. What happens with the revolution? I mean, already while the Revolutionary War was going on, states began to free their slaves. Pennsylvania was the first, and then other states followed. Within 10 years of the Revolution, the majority of states had freed their slaves. The Northwest Ordinance was passed, which prohibited slavery in the Northwest Territory, which is today Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, part of Michigan, I think. I mean, this huge territory where slavery had been legal under the British Empire. And the Northwest Ordinance was passed prohibiting that. In 1788, there was a bill introduced into the, this is still under the Articles of Confederation, but into the Congress, to ban slavery outside of the 13 states, which would have meant that that would have made it impossible to expand slavery. If you ban slavery outside of the 13 states, that means any additional territory added to the Union, any states that are admitted to the Union, slavery would be prohibited. And since states one by one were already abolishing slavery, that would have ensured the eventual abolition of slavery in the nation. In 1790, Benjamin Franklin and Alexander Hamilton submitted a petition to Congress. This was one of the last things Benjamin Franklin did in his life. I think he died about 2 months later. So this is at the very end of his life. And Franklin and Hamilton submitted a petition to the US Congress. This is only about a year, maybe less than a year, after George Washington is sworn in as president. And that bill would have outlawed slavery after 1808. This was the intention. And what needs to be understood is that nothing like this had ever occurred in human history before, ever, anywhere in the world. And I don't want to, people who like to point to other great cultures, other great periods of history, all of which are probably true, are legitimate. Great things have been contributed by every branch of the human family to the development of our species. But if you look at all of these cultures, all of these societies, all of these nations, nowhere in history had there occurred what was done in the United States in the first 10 years of its existence, where it moved to very aggressively and very rapidly to eradicate slavery. This had never been done before. And this then created the basis, which Trump actually sort of mentioned in his speech yesterday, for it began a process where over a period of decades, slavery was rolled back and eliminated all over the world. This was all a result of what was done with the American Revolution. The American Revolution was the greatest anti-slavery revolution in human history, both in its specific intention to eliminate black slavery, but in its much more profound commitment to end oligarchical rule, to create a free nation based on free labor and based on a certain understanding of the human identity and the potential that exists within every single human being. That's what we're celebrating today. That's what the fight was. That's what was accomplished in what these individuals went through. I mean, look, you think of Valley Forge, or, you know, I mean, I've always read that I think it was the first winter at Morristown, might have been the second winter at Morristown. They were there twice. But at one of the winters at Morristown, I've always read that this was actually far worse than Valley Forge. That what was left of Washington's army was at the point of practical starvation. You think of what they went through. I mean, people know the stories. Trump mentioned it again. People marching through the snow, you know, to cross the Trenton, across the Delaware and attack Trenton. You know, with blood in the snow. You think of what they went through. Was this to, you know, make money? Was this to, you know, get the British off our back so we can, you know, just make money? No, there was something far more profound that was going on. Now, look, what I want to do here is I want to talk a little bit about the Pilgrims. I just have to remove some of these pages or I'll never find my place. Yeah, all right, let's talk about the Pilgrims. So I'm actually gonna read you 2 or 3 quotes, and I hope people will be able to follow them. But the first is a quote which some people are probably familiar with. It's well known. You know, it's a short excerpt taken from a much longer work. It's from Nicholas of Cusa in 1433 in the Concordantia Catholica. And just 2 or 3 sentences from that work. Cusa says, quote, since natural law is based on reason, all law by nature is rooted in the reason of man. That's the first quote. The second quote is, there is in the people a divine seed by virtue of their common equal birth and the equal natural rights of all men, so that all authority, which comes from God, as does man himself, is recognized as divine when it arises from the common consent of all the subjects. This is the divinely ordered marital state of spiritual union based on a lasting harmony by which a commonwealth is guided in the fullness of peace toward eternal bliss. So if people didn't quite get that and they want me to reread it later, I will. But that all law is rooted in the reason of man. And there is in the people a divine seed by virtue of their common equal birth and equal natural rights. And that this is the spiritual union based on a lasting harmony by which a commonwealth is guided. So this is what Cusa is writing about. And as people know, or maybe not everyone on this call, but as a lot of people know, the voyages of discovery themselves were launched by the collaborators and friends of Nicholas of Cusa. Toscanelli, who provided the map to Columbus. Father Martins, who had lengthy communications and discussions with Christopher Columbus. These were among Cusa's closest associates. In fact, both Toscanelli and Martins were executors of Cusa's will and were with him at his deathbed. And the voyages of discovery were intended, first of all, these were the greatest scientific endeavors of their time. It's kind of like, you know, the space program today, going back to the moon, going to Mars. These were voyages of discovery. And, but at the same time, the intention was to find a way in which the intention that Cusa talks about in these quotes that I read you, that this could be realized, that this could take root somewhere else because of the horrific oligarchical domination in Europe. And then, of course, you know, people generally don't think of this, but if you look at the first person who explored the southern coast, or the coast of South America, all the way from, I think, Colombia or Venezuela, I forget which one is on the Atlantic now, but from north of Brazil, explored the entire coast of South America down to what's today called the Straits of Magellan, including sailing into the Amazon and some of the other rivers and exploring them. This was Americo Vespucci. And Vespucci was a Florentine. He was from Florence. He was a student and collaborator of Toscanelli. He was close to the Machiavelli family. And this was the exploration of South America. And then the first person to explore the coast of North America, from Florida all the way up to Maine, including sailing into New York Harbor, and he was the discoverer of New York Harbor, was Verrazano, who was also Florentine, from Florence. And Verrazano's voyage was sponsored by King Francis I of France. And Francis I was also the king who rescued Leonardo da Vinci. Da Vinci was being held essentially in captivity in Rome by the Pope. This was after the downfall of Florence, the crushing of the Florentine Republic. And Da Vinci was being held in Rome under house arrest, captivity, whatever you want to call it, not being allowed to paint, not being allowed to work. And Francis I came down to Italy and took Leonardo back with him to Paris and honored him. And this was the same king who sponsored Verrazano's trip exploring the coast of North America. So from Maine to the Straits of Magellan, the entire eastern seaboard, or most of the eastern seaboard of the two continents were explored by Florentine captains and navigators. This was a Renaissance project. This was a Renaissance project from the beginning. You know, they did not come here, the people who initiated this, to spread genocide and to enslave everyone. That is simply not the case. And whatever happened later, whatever individual people did, you have to understand the history of the entire period. So let's get on to the Pilgrims, because we're talking about the Pilgrims here. So I'm going to read you two more quotes from two more quotes right now. These are from John Robinson, Reverend John Robinson. I'm going to read one more quote a little bit later on. But one of these is in the article, the other one isn't. John Robinson was the head of the Pilgrim Church. I don't even remember what they called the church. They didn't call it the Pilgrim Church. It's just, that's how it's known today. He was the pastor of the Pilgrim Church. He never came to America. He was not allowed to. The Dutch and English authorities blocked him from leaving the Netherlands. But he wrote a lot of essays, which I've read almost all of them. And if you want to understand what the Pilgrims were doing, if you want to talk about it even, you really can't talk about it authoritatively unless you've read John Robinson's essays or some of his essays, because that's where you get the intention. That's where you get the motivation of what they were doing, what they believed in, what they were trying to do. So both of these quotes are taken from an essay entitled "Of Faith, Hope, and Love, Reason, and Sense." Now, the first one was in the article. It goes as follows. "Reason is that wherein man goes before all other earthly creatures and comes after God only. For whereas God and nature hath furnished other creatures, some with hoofs, others with instruments and weapons, both defensive and offensive, man is left naked and destitute of all of these, but may comfort himself in that one endowment of reason and providence, whereby he is able to govern them all." Now, in my mind at least, the coherence of what I just read you with what I read you earlier from Nicholas of Cusa is just absolutely clear in terms of the conception of man that we're talking about. Then the second quote is as follows. "Thus, to love God is to become godly, and to have the mind after a sort deified, being made partakers of the divine nature. He that loves not his brother whom he sees, how can he love God whom he sees not? And so natural to Christians is this brotherly love, as that the apostle makes account he need not write to the churches to teach them that which God taught them so many ways. If we were perfect in this love, we needed no other law to rule us, either in the duties toward God or our neighbors, and to love as we ought is a very happy thing, wherein we resemble God." So I hope that was clear to people. So look, why don't we just move on here. So let's just talk a little bit about the Pilgrims, maybe wake this thing up a little bit. So we're going to put up some slides, and I'll be able to talk. They'll be able to hear me, right? I'm just going to put up a few slides just to give you a sense of it. Then I have something I want to show you. But all right, why don't we go ahead, Mike? All right. So here's, this is the first, they're in order?
Yeah.
All right. So as I said, we are now in the 400th anniversary of the landing at Plymouth. And 1920 was the 300th anniversary. This is a postage stamp marking the tercentenary. This is issued obviously by the US government, landing of the Pilgrims. It's a postage stamp that was issued. Can you go to the next slide? This is another postage stamp. This is a one cent postage stamp. I guess mail was cheap in those days. And again, this with a picture of the Mayflower honoring the Pilgrims. You want to go to the next slide? This is a $50 minted in, looks like 1921, with a picture of I guess that's supposed to be a picture of the pilgrim. People often confuse this. They think the pilgrims all wore these like tall hats and long black suits, and really, from what I can tell, they didn't. This was more, this kind of dress was more common with the Puritans, although I'm not even sure most of them wore it. Anyway, this is a $50 honoring the pilgrims. You want to go to the next slide? This is the opposite side of that $50, again, with the Mayflower, all in 1920. Next slide. All right, so here is the voyage. Now, I hope people can see the different colors. I hope that that's clear. Now, if you go over to where it says the Netherlands, you'll see sort of a red or pink line with little arrows, right? Now, that is the route of the Speedwell. There were originally, the original plan was to bring 2 ships of colonists to North America. This is in 1620. The Mayflower and the Speedwell. Now the Mayflower, they hired, they paid the captain and owners of the Mayflower to take them to the New World. The Speedwell was a boat that they bought in the Netherlands. It belonged to the Pilgrim Church or some of the Pilgrim elders. And the plan was to bring colonists over, I think about 130 or 140 colonists, something like that. And then when they got to the New World, the Mayflower was going to go back, but the Speedwell was going to stay. And therefore they could use it, you know, for resupplies or, you know, to go back, you know, to Europe. One of the main things they wanted to use it for was for fishing, where they would be able to fish with it and to, you know, so they'd have something to eat. The Speedwell left from the Netherlands from a city called Delfshaven. And there were, you know, a whole bunch of pilgrim voyagers on that ship. They sailed to Southampton. You can see that, I think, Southampton on the southern coast. Now, if you look up at London, you'll see a blue line. That's the Mayflower. They left from London. The original plan was to leave from London, both ships, but they moved it to Southampton because they had gotten indications that the Board of Trade was going to block the voyage. And in fact, there were a couple of the pilgrims who were, it was a very strong possibility they might have been arrested because there was arrest warrants out for a number of them, including William Brewster. They moved the, you know, the departure point to Southampton. The Mayflower sailed to Southampton from London. The Speedwell sailed to Southampton from Delfshaven, and they met in Southampton. And everybody got on board, the 2 ships, and they sailed out. They left Southampton on August 1st. People often say, well, why did they get to the New World so late? Well, I'll explain to you why they got there so late. They left Southampton on August 5th. And, you know, and they sailed out, into the English Channel. They went a ways, and the Speedwell started to leak. And they knew they couldn't take it with the leak it had. So both ships pulled into Dartmouth, which you can see there between Southampton and Plymouth. Both ships pulled into Dartmouth, and they spent some time repairing the Speedwell. I'm not exactly sure how long this took, but they didn't. Anyway, you know, they had to repair the ship. So then both ships sailed out from Dartmouth, and you could see going off to the end of the screen there on the side that they sailed out quite a ways. They actually sailed out about 200, 250 miles, something like that.
And the speed well began to leak again, very bad leaks. So they turned around, and this time they went back to Plymouth. And they, both ships went back to Plymouth. And they tried repairing the speed well. They decided that it was too risky, that they didn't think they could repair it for the voyage. So they abandoned the Speedwell in Plymouth. And a lot of the Speedwell passengers then got on the Mayflower, which seriously overcrowded the Mayflower. They didn't all get on. There wasn't room for all of them. I think they left about 20 or 30 behind. But they got as many on as they could. They had eventually, when they left Plymouth, they had 102 passengers. And that I think there were about 20 people in the crew, which was more passengers than the Mayflower should have carried. So they finally left Plymouth on September 6th. So, so at that point, they had already been delayed over a month from when they were supposed to leave. You want to go to the next slide? All right, so this is what happened to them. Their destination was New York. That's where they intended to go. Now, at that point, this was all considered Virginia. If you look there on the little map, there's a line drawn across it, and it says, 1620 border between Virginia and New England. Well, I don't think that's actually accurate. Shortly after that, the Virginia Company ceded half of its claim to this new company called the New England Company. But at the time of the Pilgrim Voyage, it was all considered Virginia. All of it was considered Virginia. And north of New York City, it was considered Northern Virginia, and south of New York City, it was considered Southern Virginia. Their plan was to sail to New York Harbor and to establish a colony there. This is before the Dutch set up a colony. There were Dutch fur trappers and traders in the area, but there was no real Dutch colony. And their intention was to go there and establish a colony. What happened, if you look up there by Cape Cod, you'll see that blue squiggly line. That is the Mayflower. And what happened is that they didn't miss New York. You say, well, Cape Cod's a long ways from New York, but not really. If you look at the map, if they had managed to get around Cape Cod and then just sail down along the coast, it's a straight shot all the way through Long Island Sound, or what's today Long Island Sound, to New York. But they got to Cape Cod and they ran into fierce storms. And they made several attempts to get around Cape Cod, and they couldn't do it. They were afraid the ship was going to get wrecked. So they turned around and they went around to the north of Cape Cod. And they decided, well, this is where we are. This is where we're going to go. There were no maps really to speak of that were of much use. And, they were sort of feeling their way. So they ended up, going north of Cape Cod. They realized pretty quickly, they explored Cape Cod. They realized that there was no way to settle on Cape Cod. So they went over and they started exploring the coast. Now, they got to, they anchored initially in Cape Cod off of, you can leave it up for a second. They anchored initially off of Cape Cod at Provincetown. And that was on November 11th. And then they sailed over towards the coast and anchored off the coast, and they sent out smaller boats, or it might have just been one boat. They sent out several times. They sent out smaller boats with teams to explore along the coast to find a suitable place for a colony. And, they needed water, they needed arable land, they needed something that would be a little bit defensible against possible Indian attacks. So
it took them a while. So they actually did not really decide on Plymouth until, towards the second or so week in December. So they spent more than a month. They spent 5 or 6 weeks trying to find a place for a colony. And so eventually they landed at Plymouth, and they started disembarking on December 21st, first day of winter. So, this is why they ended up there in the midst of, or the beginning of, extremely harsh winter. Is there any more slides, or is that it? Oh yeah, look, we've all been in the lockdown here. And, I want to give you, we're talking about Washington at Valley Forge and what people did to win American freedom in 1776. But I ask you to think about what these people went through. They fled from England to escape from the rule of James I and the Anglican Church. They fled from the Netherlands when the situation became intolerable there. They went out on this ship, and there were 102 passengers. Now, if you look at this, this is sort of a cross section of the ship, and if you look at it, you'll see. Now, the Mayflower is a small ship or boat, whatever it's called. The dimensions of the Mayflower as a whole, the ship itself, it's only 100 feet long and 24 feet wide. And that's not very big to go across the Atlantic Ocean, without a motor. So it's a very small ship to begin with. But then if you look at this cross section, you'll see an area there called the gun deck. I don't know if you can see that. It's called the gun deck. It's kind of in the middle. That's where the Pilgrims lived. That was where they were. The rest of the ship was given over for other purposes. Cargo hold was down below, and all of these other things you see, the cabin, that's the captain's cabin, I think. The steerage room, the gun room, the forecastle. The forecastle is where the kitchen was for the sailors. But, the rest of the ship was given over to the operation of the ship or the cargo. They were in the gun deck. Now, that area in the gun deck is only 1,200 square feet. 1,200 square feet, right? They had 102 people in there, right? 102 people. And also the ceiling was only 5.5 feet tall. And they had 102 people in there. And if you look at the voyage, what? Fine. No, it's not. You got the picture on the screen.
They can see you too, I think.
Oh, you can see me too?
Maybe.
All right. If you look at the picture there, 1,200 square feet. Now, if you look at the voyage, they left Southampton on August 5th, and they arrived at Plymouth, disembarkation day, on December 21st. That's 4.5 months. 4.5 months where 102 people were in this area that was 1,200 square feet. They were confined. So if you think the lockdown is bad, imagine having 102 people in 1,200 square feet for 4.5 months. And it actually, for a lot of them, it was longer, because they arrived at December 21st, but the ground was frozen, snow on the ground. They couldn't build anything. They built one large building, which they used as a hospital. And but most of the passengers stayed on board until the spring, because there was no shelter ashore. So most of the passengers stayed on board until the spring. So you're talking about not 4.5 months, but more like 7 months in which they were confined. You know, they did not have the run of the ship. This was the voyage itself. They ran into early winter storms, which they could have avoided if they had been able to get out earlier. And it was a very tempestuous voyage. There were periods where there was no wind and they were becalmed and they just sat there for days. They ran into several severe storms. At least one person was swept overboard. At one point in one of the storms, the mast broke, the main mast, and they almost were unable to repair it. And if they hadn't repaired it, they wouldn't have gotten to the New World. They would have died in the middle of the ocean if they hadn't been able to repair the mast. I mean, it is the case that when they left Southampton and then when they eventually left from Plymouth, you know, most of the people, maybe all of them, knew that there was a very good chance that they were all going to die before they got to the New World. This was a very, very dangerous voyage that they were embarked in. People did not go up on deck because you could be swept overboard. Other things could happen to you. So they were confined in this cargo hold. And this is what they did. You know, this is what they did to come here. So what I think I'll read you right now to give you a sense of what they what was in their heart. The Mayflower stayed until April. They were supposed to go right back. They had only been hired to bring them there. But essentially, the captain of the Mayflower, I think his name was Jones, he sort of took pity on the Pilgrims. And I think developed a real friendship with them. He was not one of them. But he agreed to keep the ship there until the spring. Otherwise, I don't know if they would have made it. So he went back. The Mayflower left, I think, in April, and then they were stranded there for a number of months. Half of them died by the 1st of June. One person died in the voyage. By the time they got to Provincetown, they were most of them were extremely sick. 4 of them died after they got to Provincetown, but before they arrived at Plymouth, while they were searching for a place for a colony. And then over the course of the next few months, a huge number of them died, including the governor, John Carver, and his wife, and the rest of them were just sort of stranded there. A second ship arrived, I think in October, if I'm not mistaken, of 1621. This was called, I believe, I don't know, I think it's the Little James, but a second ship arrived. And this ship had brought with it, among other people, more colonists came. And one of them was a man named Robert Cushman. Cushman had been on the Speedwell. He was supposed to come over on the first voyage. But he, when they couldn't fit everyone on the Mayflower, he remained behind. And he was one of the leaders of the Pilgrim Church. And he came over on the second boat. And on December 21st, 1621, he gave a sermon to all of the colonists. This is on the 1-year anniversary of the disembarkation, 1 year to the day. Now, it's a long sermon, but I'm just going to read you a short paragraph from it. He says, "Seek the good of your brethren, please them, honor them, reverence them. Every man must seek the good of another. Howsoever some may think this too large a practice, since now the world is so full of people, yet I see not but the more people there is, the larger charity ought to be. We are bound to each other, so that his wants must be my wants, his sorrow, my sorrow, his sickness, my sickness, and his welfare, my welfare. For I am as he is, and such a sweet symphony were excellent, comfortable, yea, heavenly, and is the only maker and observer of churches and commonwealths. Men are forced to ask sometimes rather than starve, but indeed in all societies it should be offered to them. What is man if he be not sociable, kind, affable, free-hearted, liberal? He is a beast in the shape of a man. Nothing in this world doth more resemble heavenly happiness than for men to live as one, being of one heart." So that was the sermon that these colonists heard on the first anniversary of their landing. You know, I don't know what else to say. This is what the intention was, to found a society in which people could live like human beings, could live free, but, you know, free in the sense of recognizing the divine spark of reason and creativity and brotherhood, which exists within each one of us. And this is why they came. And this was what the society they endeavored to build. And in 1630, they were joined by the Puritans, or actually there was a 1628 colony of the Puritans at Salem, but Winthrop's fleet came over, 10 ships in 1630. And this was the intention right from the beginning, to escape from oligarchical rule, to escape from a society based on, the reducing human beings to the level of beasts and enslaving them, to create a society based on real freedom, not just freedom against oppression, but freedom for, building a productive future. And that is what they were. That is what they were intending to do. Now, there's probably a lot more I can go through, but I think I'm going to stop. But I want to just read you one more thing. It's very short, because I just want to bring this up. Look, you know, what we're dealing with today is so evil, and so I can't even find the right word for it. You know, going around painting on statues, destroying statues. I mean, they desecrated Cervantes' statue in Golden Gate Park. Cervantes had been a slave for 5 years, not a slave owner, a slave. He was captured by the Ottoman Turks because he had been in the Spanish military. He was captured. He was held in captivity. He was not sold into slavery, because the ones they examined, these people they captured, and the ones they thought could be ransomed, where they could get more money for them, they held them for ransom, and the rest were just sold on the slave markets, sold to the highest bidder. And but being held for ransom, he was held for ransom for 5 years. But while you were being held for ransom, you were not owned by any one particular person as property, but you were worked as a slave. I mean, you were in fact a slave. And if no one ever came up with your ransom, then you were a slave for the rest of your life. And so Cervantes had been a slave, and now people throw paint on his statue. George Washington, slave owner, they paint on his statue. So I want to make a point about Washington. Again, so the people, you know, this queasiness. Well, yeah, America's great, but America's wonderful, but I mean, don't we have to apologize for something? You know, do it if you want to. I find it repulsive. Washington was adamantly, passionately opposed to slavery. I mean, this thing about how, well, you know, well, Washington freed his slaves in his will. Yeah, he did that. But if that's your argument, then you don't know Washington, right? Washington was at his soul, in his soul, in his heart, passionately committed to ending slavery. I'll reference 3 letters Washington wrote, and I'll read you a short excerpt from one of them, and then we'll end there. During the Revolutionary War, there was an individual named John Laurens, Laurens. Now, John Laurens was Alexander Hamilton's closest friend. Now, Hamilton later in life developed a lot of, he developed some people who were very close friends of his, like Gouverneur Morris and some other people. But most of these people, John Jay, Gouverneur Morris, what have you, were older than Hamilton. Jay was quite a bit older than Hamilton. John Laurens was Hamilton's age. They were both about 20 years old, time of the Revolution. So they were, you're friends with people your own age. Laurens was, without question, Hamilton's most intimate friend. And Laurens came from a big slave owning family in South Carolina. His father owned this big plantation with a lot of slaves. But Laurens, who was a soldier in the American Revolution, and he was actually killed in one of the last battles of the Revolution, I think in like 1782 or something, after Yorktown, he was killed. But during the Revolution, John Laurens, besides being in the Army, in the Continental Army, he was also a member of the South Carolina State Legislature. And during the Revolutionary War, he introduced a bill in the South Carolina legislature to abolish slavery in South Carolina. Didn't pass, but he introduced a bill to abolish slavery in South Carolina. When George Washington heard of this, I think he heard of it through Hamilton or through someone else. When George Washington heard of this, he wrote a long letter to John Laurens, praising him. I mean, I've read the letter, just, saying that this is a magnificent thing he's done, that Washington is so happy with it, that we have to rid the nation of this evil of slavery. Now, this is a private letter, so this was not done for public relations, to make your image good or something. This is a private letter. Now, in a second letter, after the Revolutionary War, I think this was in the 1790s. No, it was probably in the 1780s because it was before the French Revolution. But after the Revolutionary War, the Marquis de Lafayette bought a plantation. I'm not sure where. It was in the Caribbean. I forget which island it was on. But he bought a plantation, which was a slave plantation. And the first thing that Lafayette did was free all the slaves, except you just set them free. And he said, I'm going to run this plantation. I don't know if it was sugar or rice or indigo. I don't know what it was. But he said, I'm going to run this plantation with free labor. I'm going to hire people to work for me. And he freed all the slaves. He didn't sell them. He freed them. And when Washington heard of this, he also wrote a letter to Lafayette, which was very similar to the letter to John Laurens, just praising Lafayette for taking this action and saying that this should serve as a model for what needs to be done everywhere. Now, I will read you a little section from a letter. This is very short, just a sentence, from a letter that George Washington wrote to Robert Morris. and I'm not sure the year of this. I'm really not sure. But Washington wrote a letter to Robert Morris, speaking of slavery, where Washington says, "There is not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of slavery," unquote. That was Washington. You know, and I'll read you another quote. This is from Patrick Henry, you know, because Patrick Henry is, you know, give me liberty or give me death. And he sort of had a checkered career, but he was pretty loyal to Washington. And he actually sided with Washington against Jefferson in the 1790s. But in a letter that Patrick Henry wrote in 1773, so this is 3 years before the Declaration of Independence, Patrick Henry wrote a letter to a guy named Robert Pleasant, where he says, quote, "I believe a time will come when an opportunity will be offered to abolish this lamentable evil." So that's what you've got. This was the intention. This was the intention. The American Revolution was intended to end the system of global slavery that had existed everywhere in the world for millennia. And this is what these people accomplished. And that's our heritage. And that's what we represent. That's what we're fighting for today. Well, I think I'll just stop there, you know, and we can open it up. I probably talked longer than I should have.
No, it's great. No. All right, so that was a really powerful presentation. I think that what we're going to do now, the basic idea is not to have a formal, you know, these formal webcast Zooms where you can raise a hand or chat in a question. This is a bit more of a free-for-all to ask questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to allow people to unmute themselves. And so this is basically a chance. Now, if you get out of control, I'll mute you. But the point is that we want to actually take what Bob just presented, which is, I think, along with this paper and now this class, is an incredibly important intervention into the discourse of our nation and of the world today, because it is that question of ending this oligarchical system once and for all. Not proving that it can be done, now actually doing the job on a global scale. So, so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to allow people to unmute themselves. It'll be a back and forth with Bob. Bob will moderate and control the discussion process. And as we certainly have at least an hour. And if we go longer, as long as we've got a healthy participation, I don't see a reason not to extend it a little bit. But that's the basic idea. So think about your questions, think about the dialogue, and let's jump into it.
All right, just keep your finger on that mute button.
Yeah, you got it. You got it. You got it.
All right, so it's open.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a question. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Who are you?
This is Ian Overton in Houston.
Oh, hi, Ian.
Hi, Bob. Good to see you. So my question is on any sort of literature written by the key people from the period from the landing at Plymouth up to the Revolution that you would recommend as key sources. You mentioned that the letter or two from Washington, that's handy, or other particular things that you found that would be good to go and read of people in their own words, where they're making this point that the founding of the United States, or what became the United States, was founded on this question of ending the slaveocracy. Thanks.
Yeah, I maybe if I check into it a little bit, I can email you some recommendations. There's nothing particular that comes to mind right now. I mean, Gouverneur Morris's speech at the Constitutional Convention, Philadelphia Convention, is available in various places. You could probably just do a web search for it. Gouverneur Morris's speech is phenomenal, just phenomenal. You know, a take no prisoners speech, attacking slavery. You know, I've gleaned a lot of this stuff from various sources. Something here, something there. I mean, these last two quotes I read to you, Washington's letter to Robert Morris, and then this Patrick Henry thing. I just found this day before yesterday in a book written by Arnold. What's his name?
Isaac Arnold.
Isaac Arnold. You know, but you know, you just pick these things up here and there, and you look into them. You know, you can find. I mean, in my article, I quote portions of the founding statements, founding principles of the New York Abolition Society and the Pennsylvania Abolition Society.
About the Cooper Union.
Those things are available. Also, I would really recommend people read, and this is certainly available with a Google search or whatever search engine you use. Abraham Lincoln's Cooper Union speech. This is really, people think they know it, but a lot of people have actually never read it, or they read it 30 years ago and have forgotten it. It's a phenomenal speech, really phenomenal speech. And he goes through explicitly he essentially proves that the intention of the people at the Constitutional Convention was to not allow the spread of slavery. It's really a remarkable speech. But you know, it's like anything. You read a 200-page book and you find 5 pages that are really, really good. But I'll see what I can dig up. You know, see what I can find. That's all I can say right now.
Hey, Bob, this is Marcia
Can you
Bowen.
hear me okay? Hello? Can I be heard?
Marcia was first.
Hi. I wanted to ask if you could go through some more on the history of slavery and Wall Street.
Hello?
Maybe
Hello, are you taking?
Connie can't hear me.
Just tell her that you're taking Marcia Bowen.
Marcia Bowen. We're taking Marcia Bowen first,
And then Connie.
and then Connie.
Okay. The history of Wall Street as
Hello?
a slave market operation.
Yeah, well, I mentioned this cotton economy thing in my article. I mean, look, what happened was that in the 1790s, well, no, that's not even worth talking about. Look, the real catastrophe that happened, and you know, and I know there are some people who still defend the War of 1812. I've polemicized against this for a long time. But the outcome of the War of 1812 was catastrophic for the country. And one of the things that happened was during and after the War of 1812, you had the massive expansion of slavery in 2 forms. One is you had the admission to the Union of all of these slave states in the Deep South and slave territories. This included Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Arkansas, Florida as a slave territory by, I think, 1817, 1818. And this continued to spread. And then, of course, later, Texas was brought in. But I mean, you're talking about hundreds and hundreds of square miles. I don't know, thousands. I don't even know how big. I think I have it written down somewhere. But just this huge amount of new territory added to the country as slave states and slave territory. And this had never been done before. You know, Kentucky and Tennessee had been brought in, but that was somewhat different. And there were that's a complicated story, and there were restrictions placed on slavery in Tennessee and Kentucky. And really the federal government really couldn't prevent it because they had been parts of Virginia and North Carolina. But, you know, it was generally, not only was slavery prohibited in the Northwest Territory, but it was generally understood that no new territory, that all new territory added to the Union, any future new territory would be brought in as free territory, that slavery would not be allowed. This was agreed by almost everyone in the 1780s and 1790s, including the southern states. That all changed, and it changed in particular after the War of 1812. And these places were brought in. And you had this massive expansion of slavery, which had been restricted to this handful of states along the southeastern seaboard. With that expansion of slave territory, you had the development of the cotton economy, which stretched from Georgia through the Deep South all the way over into Texas by the time Texas came in. Now, this was the British, Barbados slave labor model. It was it wasn't just slavery. It was a slave labor economic system. It was financed almost entirely, well, it was financed entirely, not almost entirely, through London, Wall Street, and then the banking center they established in New Orleans. But the primary financial backers of it were in London. And in Wall Street, as some people know, this is the period in which you've got August Belmont, who was sort of the junior league JP Morgan of his day. And the Wall Street operation by the 1820s, 1830s was just developing into an arm, an appendage of the London banking operations. So, they created this gigantic slave labor economic system across the whole southeastern and southern rim of the United States. This was a financial policy, an economic policy, huge profits. 80% of the cotton was shipped to England. This was part of what they did. So I don't know what more to say about it than that. Look, as I said, you look at the history of imperial rule. You have empires going back a long time, but if you look at this Anglo-Dutch model, what was created in Amsterdam and then later in London, these are monetary, financial empires. But what's the foundation for them? It's the extraction of loot, the extraction of wealth, through around the world. This was continued through the 19th century into the 20th century. This is what Franklin Roosevelt wanted to end. Malthusianism, mass murder, keeping people backwards with huge profits, flowing in to the imperial financial system. This is what it's always been, throughout human history, brought to its probably most evil pinnacle by the British Empire. And that's what the founding fathers were fighting. And that's what this is really all about. It's not about race per se. The race thing really comes later. I'm not an expert on this by any stretch of the imagination, but it's really in the 19th century, after Darwin, with people like Thomas Huxley and others and their friends at Columbia University and, in Boston, this eugenics movement, where you start to get this intensive discussion of races. You go back to the 15th century, 14th century, They were enslaving everybody. It didn't matter what color you were. I mean, there were hundreds of thousands of white Europeans who were slaves in the Islamic world. They just, anybody they conquered, anybody they came across, anyone they could seize would be enslaved. There were, look, there were at least 300,000 Irish slaves who were shipped out of Ireland. This is under Cromwell's so-called Commonwealth. There were at least 300,000 Irish slaves who were shipped to the Caribbean under Cromwell as slaves, not indentured servants, slaves, and sold into slavery to work in the sugar plantations. You know, this was not about race. It was about an imperial oligarchical system, financial system, oligarchical rule. So the, you know, the race thing.
He's asking about Wall Street.
Yeah, I know you're asking about Wall Street, but you know, that's all I can really say about it. I mean, it's, you know, this is what Wall Street has largely been based on. This is what the City of London is based on. The financial policies are always tied to this kind of looting, this kind of, you know, subjugation of people. So the, that probably doesn't answer your question, but that's all I can say.
Good.
Next person.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, this is Connie in Houston. Bravo, first off. This was the most amazing thing, which I've been waiting for months to hear all this or get it all, you know, together. And I just have two things to throw out and, you know, kick around and see what you think about this. I'm just glad we don't have to apologize for being American. And number one, we should take this show on the road, you know, to Europe, especially our European friends would learn a lot from this. And number two, I'm thinking, I mean, this is a huge thing, but I'm thinking how Putin, you know, had to go through all the trouble to write this corrected history of World War II, the Great Patriotic War, because of how Russia was being maligned. And, you know, we had LaRouche, who's the American, true American in this system. And I'm just thinking that somehow, you know, maybe Mike's next project or your project, we should write a correct history of this period, a correct history of America. I know we have a lot of writings, you know, the Pear book, we have all kind of history books, your writings. The correct history of America has to be gotten out there. Thank you.
Well, I would endorse that. It sounds like a good project for Mike.
Nice car, maybe.
No, thank you. We'll see what we can do. Next person.
Hi, Mike. This is Don Sellers. Bob. Sorry.
No problem.
My question is is the oligarchy still doing slavery, and does it look like drug slavery instead
Yeah,
of
well,
just, you know, working slavery?
Right. Well, there are many different forms of slavery. I mean, you know, the British Empire, at the point that slavery really became less and less profitable. The slave trade became, you know, taking slaves out of Africa, transporting them to the New World, selling them in the New World. This became less and less profitable as towards the end of the 18th century. And at a certain point, it wasn't profitable at all. What they did in the United States is after 1801, the way slavery actually spread in the United States is that Virginia and Maryland essentially became breeding states. You know, the slaves were really needed or, you know, intended for the cotton economy. There was no cotton growing in Maryland. Well, I don't think in Virginia either. and the tobacco thing played itself out to a large extent. But what they did in Maryland and Virginia is they began breeding. They literally, I mean, this was big business. This went on for decades, breeding huge numbers of slave children, and then they would sell them down south to the, into the deep south. But the transatlantic slave trade became less profitable, and eventually, it was no longer a financial incentive to continue it. But what did the British do? They moved immediately. In fact, they really overlapped. It wasn't like one followed the other. They overlapped. They moved immediately into opium, into narcotics. And from being the largest slave trading empire in human history, they became the largest drug trafficking empire in human history. Just like that. And, as I think should be obvious to everyone, drug addiction is a form of slavery. It's, in some ways, it's much worse than physical slavery, because in physical slavery, your body is enslaved. With drugs, your mind is enslaved. Your soul is enslaved. And certainly that's rampant today. You have other things, like debt slavery. Think of, we've written about the International Monetary Fund and all these terrible people, these equity funds that do all these horrible things, IMF conditionalities. But, this deliberate policy of massively indebting third world countries and then using that debt to enforce murderous austerity on these countries, killing people, impoverishing people through debt. And obviously the same thing is done in the United States and in Europe, maybe not as extreme, but certainly very bad, where you have tens of millions of people who are massively in debt and have no way of getting out of that debt. No way of getting out of that debt. You're debt slaves of this financial system. So there are many different forms of slavery. And certainly it continues to this day. There is still an illegal slave trade. I don't know much about it. What I've read is that it's, actual slavery. There have been various exposés in particular on slave trading that continues in places like Saudi Arabia, some of the Gulf states, but that's not, that's, people who fixate on that. Is it bad? Is it evil? Sure. But, that's a small piece of the picture when you look at things like drugs and economic exploitation. It's, the elite have always believed that they are, have the divine right, except they don't believe in God, but that they have the divine right to rule, and that everyone else is expendable, to be exploited. And they always have believed that, and they still believe it today, So anyway, I hope that answers your question.
We got a phone caller from San Francisco.
Yes, my name is Susan from San Francisco. I agree wholeheartedly with everything that you've been saying. In fact, I just wanted to add to that. We have slavery today, right in America, when we have children that are graduating from college owing a minimum of $250,000 or more in student loans for their education. Tell me that's not indebted now to starting their lives out with a ball and chain financially around their legs, waiting for them to just owe the system more and fall into further and further and further debt. It's not to mention the sex trade and the illegal immigrant trade and cartels and everything else that's bringing people. So there's current day slavery going on throughout the world, including in the United States. I just wanted to add that. Thanks.
No, you're absolutely right. Thank you. Okay, next person.
Go ahead. Go.
Hey, Bob?
Yeah.
Hello?
Who's this?
This is Ted.
Hello, Ted.
Hey, Bob. One of the more interesting features about
You better
the
speak up.
article was your description of the activities of Henry Clay. And I would like to speak on that question for obvious reasons.
You would like to speak on it, or you want me to speak on it? Well, you know, I really think you have to, I read some quotes. I read the quote from Nicholas of Cusa, you know, which in my mind is very coherent with the intention of the founding of this country. But I read some of the quotes from the Pilgrims, from John Robinson, you know, and, you know, freedom was not freedom against, was freedom for, freedom to create a better society, freedom based on a certain intention, certain notion of what it means to be a human being and what the human creative potential actually is. And then to formulate policy which would further that intention. And as I discussed, that's really the right way to think about Hamilton's banking and credit policies and the Society for Useful Manufacturers. There is no way you can honor, or that you can, you know, represent or honor or you know, try to develop the kind of nation which was intended if you supported and fought for the existence of slavery, particularly after the Revolution and after the Washington administration. Look, the Washington administration, George Washington, I read you know, I referenced these letters he wrote. There's a lot more I could say about Washington and slavery. John Jay, founder of the first, you know, abolition society. Hamilton, you know, co-founder of the first abolition society. Gouverneur Morris, passionate opponent of slavery. And Rufus King, who authored the Northwest Ordinance, all of these people. This was the Washington administration. You know, this was an administration absolutely committed to ending slavery. And that was the intention of the revolution. And Henry Clay, you know, people say, the American system, the American system, the American system. I don't want to hear it, really, frankly. America is not an economic, you know, policy. America is not an economic recipe. It's based on a profound understanding of what it means to be a human being, and an intention to develop that into the future for future generations. And you cannot do that if you're committed to slavery. You know, Clay was not just a slave owner. And there's a big difference between being a slave owner in 1840 and being a slave owner in 1760. I mean, in 1760, slavery was legal in all 13 colonies. Now, slavery was not legal in the United States of America in 1760 because there was no United States of America. We were British colonies, and the existence of slavery in the colonies was ordered by the British monarchy and imposed by the British monarchy. And you had a lot of people who became slave owners, a lot of people, including people who signed the Declaration of Independence and people who signed the Constitution, but they were coming out of, they grew up in, and they grew to adulthood in a growing slave-based system that had been imposed on them by Britain. And once they got free from Britain, they began to dismantle that system. So, you know, I'm not going to go back to 1760 or 1770 and say, slave owner, slave owner. I mean, people who do that are morons, you know, and it's a lie, and it's a complete misrepresentation of history. But if you are not only a slave owner, but if you are defending slavery and acting to spread slavery in 1840, 1830, 1820, that's different. That's different. That means, you know, the United States has been in existence for 50 years. And if you're fighting to defend and spread slavery in the 1820s and 1830s, that means you are committed to slavery. And that was Henry Clay. He was, you know, and he did some things which were really quite despicable. And as I said, the catastrophe was the War of 1812, and what occurred coming out of the War of 1812, with the spread of this slave-based economic system. And War of 1812 ends in 1815. The very next year, in 1816, Clay founds the American Colonization Society, whose intention was never to send all the slaves back to Africa. Look, they sent between 1816 and 1860, right? That's 44 years, 1816 to 1860. They sent about 14 or 15,000 freed slaves back to Africa, most of whom died, by the way, when they got there, because they were dumped, you know, in this place where they didn't, you know, they all spoke some form of English. They didn't speak any African languages. They'd been in America for generations, and the tribes that were living in Liberia didn't want them there, and you know, it was a disaster. They sent about 14 or 15,000 slaves back to Africa over 44 years. That's out of 4.5 million slaves and free slaves in the United States. 15,000 out of 4.5 million. What percentage is that? I don't even know. 1/10 of 1%. This was never a serious effort to send the freed slaves back to Africa. That was not its intention at all, ever. The intention of the American Colonization Society was to crush abolition, to crush the momentum for abolition, right? Which is what they then did. You know, they launched race riots, they murdered people, they burnt down churches and buildings, they shut down abolition newspapers. There was a lot of support for abolition in the South, a lot of support. And they just wiped that all out. People who were published, like for instance, I mentioned, not in this article, but in an article I wrote some time ago, I mentioned this guy Cassius Clay, not the boxer who became Muhammad Ali, but the original Cassius Clay, who was a cousin of Henry Clay. Now, Cassius Clay started out as a big slave owner from Kentucky. His family, the plantation family, but he had a change of heart when he became an adult, and he became passionately committed to abolition, and he freed all his slaves, something which Henry Clay never did. Then he became the publisher of an abolition newspaper, first in Kentucky, but that was then destroyed by a mob, and he had to move. And then I think he moved over the border into Ohio, if I'm not mistaken, and reestablished his newspaper. But there were 2 assassination attempts on his life. Once he was shot, once he was stabbed, you know, and the intention was to kill him. And this was going on all over the country.
And it was the American Colonization Society that was behind all of it. All of it. Murder, mayhem, riots. And Henry Clay was the president of that organization. You know, so I have nothing good to say about Henry Clay. So anyway, next question.
Bob, got a sec, I mean, yes, Bob.
Hold on.
Got a second question regarding, this is Don Sellers again.
Yeah.
Got a second question regarding Mexico and slavery. I was just reading something about how Santa Anna in 1824 abolished the Constitution, and then the Texans used it to justify taking Texas away from Mexico, where slavery wasn't legal. What do you know about that?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on the whole situation around Mexico and Texas. I know a little bit about it, or more than a little bit, but I'm not an expert on it. But what I do know is that when slavery was legal in the Spanish Empire and continued to be legal through, I think they still had slaves in the Spanish colonies all the way up into the 1880s. I think Spain was one of the last of the European countries to abolish slavery. Slavery was legal in the Spanish Empire, but when the Mexican Revolution occurred, someone who's on the call may know the exact year of that. I don't recall. I think it was in the 1820s. When the Mexican Revolution occurred and Mexico declared its independence from Spain, it abolished slavery. Now, I would argue, without knowing a lot of the details, that this is precisely, what the American Revolution created the possibility of, right? That as America freed its slaves, as America created a land based on freedom and economic progress, other nations would aspire, other peoples would aspire to do the same thing. But whatever actually occurred in Mexico, they abolished slavery. And it was after Texas was, quote unquote, won its independence from Mexico and became an independent republic, that slavery was reintroduced into Texas by the new government there. And then, of course, the fight over the admission of Texas to the Union was a huge fight, which I touched on in my article. I think I have a quote from William Jay in there where he talks about his opposition to the admission of Texas as a slave state. This was a big deal. Slavery was illegal in Mexico. And in Texas, Texas was part of Mexico, and slavery was illegal in Texas and was reintroduced when Texas became independent.
Bob, we have a question from Keisha.
Yeah, Keisha. Keisha?
Okay, here I am. Hi, Bob.
Hi.
Hi. So you, well, first of all, I did read again for the 4th of July, Frederick Douglass's speech, what is the 4th of July to the slave, to the Negro. And right. You mentioned that in your paper, which I think is very appropriate. And that is definitely what some people may say is a controversial paper. But I think one thing that it really addresses, and I'd like for you to speak on this, is this question of the freedom of the mind, and really going as Douglass makes the argument that anybody who says that the intention of the founding fathers, or particularly the intention of the Constitution, was a intention of slavery, he completely dismantles that. And I think the question is not just one, will you say a little bit more on the importance of looking at it from that side, not just what are the intentions of the founding fathers and the slave holders and the non-slave holders, but for the people who were in bondage, how did they actually, as Douglas, how did they view the Constitution and this ability to recognize freedom? So I thought you did that very beautifully in your paper. And as I said, it's a controversial paper to a lot of people because they take certain parts of it, the 4th of July, Independence Day, so forth, doesn't mean anything to me, the Black.
Well, boy, that's quite a question. I mean, the 4th of July should mean something to people. I mean, look, forget the hot dogs and the barbecues. I mean, that's all fun, it's all fun. But, it's like a lot of these holidays, like Memorial Day or Martin Luther King Day or, Thanksgiving. It's worth, besides the good food and the good camaraderie with people you're with, it's very useful to reflect on what these holidays, what it is we're actually honoring and celebrating. Well, I don't know if I could say much more about the Constitution. I mean, that's a funny speech. Well, not a funny speech, but, the speech you're referencing, which I referenced in the article, because he goes through a lot in that speech, and it's quite a speech. And for people who have not read it, I certainly encourage people to read it. Frederick Douglass' July 4th speech. But, in the second part of that speech is where he defends the Constitution and makes the argument that the American Revolution was an anti-slavery revolution, and that the Constitution did not recognize slavery, that this was not a slave-based nation from its inception, and in fact, he ends up calling the Constitution a great freedom document, which is quite something when you consider who Frederick Douglass is. He could have easily just said, white people have enslaved black. I mean, he was a slave. He was a runaway slave. But he proclaims the Constitution as a great anti-slavery document, a great freedom document. I'm not going to go into a lot of technical details. A lot of the argument that Douglass makes is taken from this guy Lysander Spooner, who wrote this book, which was fairly widely read and influential about the time that the Republican Party was being created in the 1850s, in which Spooner goes through excruciating detail, proving that the Constitution was an anti-slavery document. Douglass actually references Spooner in his speech. But, this is what it is. I mean, look, people today who say, well, what does July 4th mean to me? I'm poor, I'm oppressed, I'm in debt, I can't get out of my circumstances, I'm in a horrible condition. What has this ever done for me? The country's just ruled by elites who don't care about me. Well, you have to rise above that. I mean, not just rise above it, but you have to stop being a victim. And I don't say that argumentatively or pejoratively. The people who landed in Plymouth were not victims. The people who were at Valley Forge were not victims. Frederick Douglass, who certainly had every legitimate excuse to be a victim, was not a victim. You're building something better for the future. You're building something better for the future. And that is what the American Revolution made possible. Not that it guaranteed it, not that it set in some structure in which we're all going to be propelled into the future and flying around in,
vehicles and God knows what, nothing is guaranteed, ever. But it made such a future possible. That's what July 4th is all about. And prior to the American Revolution, that kind of a human productive future was not possible for the overwhelming majority of humanity. So this is what we're celebrating today. And it's our job today to fight for that future. To say, okay, we're going to take up that mantle today. We're going to take up that fight now. And we're going to ensure that we honor and fulfill the mission that these people started 250 years ago, or with the Pilgrims even 400 years ago. So that's the only way I can answer the question.
Good. We got three questions in line. So first, Mindy.
Okay. Hi, Bob.
Hi.
Hi. So I want to say two things. One, I concur with Connie. We should get this out, and you should do a Thursday call because people around us really need this discussion. And I know, okay. So the second thing, though, that I thought was really important, and, growing up, you always heard that, the Pilgrims came over because it was religious freedom as a very narrow sense of religion. But really what you made very clear, it was about universal principles. Going to Cusa and company. Go ahead.
Let me respond to that and move on. Look, the Pilgrims were clearly, and I read all these essays of Robinson. I read On Plymouth Plantation by Bradford, and there were some other writings, one called Mort's Relation, and there were a couple of other writings that I read a lot of what's available from the Pilgrim Brethren, and they were extremely religious, very devoutly religious. But it was a certain kind of devoutness and a certain kind of religion. Very devoutly religious, but it was grounded in this idea that each human being, from whatever station in life, race, creed, every new human being who is born into the world is born in the image of God and has innate access to reason, to creativity, and to brotherhood based on a sharing of this unique human identity. And this was what they were determined to create a society based on. So for them, that was religion, So go ahead, Mindy.
Yeah. No, that's what I was getting at, is because it's a different notion of religion in the universal principles. And that was a founding, like you said earlier, they weren't running away from something. They were trying to create something better. And that's different than running from something. So I think the way you expressed it is what I was thinking versus some kind of doctrinated question.
Yeah. Yes. In fact, there's something I didn't read, and I don't have it with me, but there's another funny quote from, I don't know if it's not Robinson, it might have been Cushman, might have been one of these others, but in one of their sermons or something, they said, they go through and say, this is what we're committed to. This is what we're fighting for. And he says, it's not a question of saying, well, we should have done it in this other location, or we should have done it back in Holland, or we should have gone to Virginia and done it in Virginia. He said, you do it where you are. That wherever you happen to be, this is where you fight for the future, So I always like that. So.
Joelle's next. Joelle, you there?
Unmute. Oh, sorry, I was muted. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. this has been a really wonderful presentation that you've given us. I just want to thank you for that. And I wanted to ask you if you could say something about this argument that the reason why people are pulling down statues of Confederate generals and such, and now it's turned into this indiscriminate thing where they're just pulling down everything, is because the generals were anti-American, that they wanted to secede, they wanted to get away from the Union in order to have their slavery.
Right, okay, yeah. Yeah, sure. Well, look, I'll tell you, 45 years ago, I'm from New York, you know, and 45 years ago, I had the unfortunate experience of living in Richmond, Virginia. And the place I really didn't like, no reflection on people who are from Virginia. But one of the things that happened was I had a shocking experience, which sort of boggled my mind when I ran across it, which is in Richmond, Virginia, they have this big boulevard, you know, center island, tree lined, you know, real nice. And they call it Monument Boulevard. And at every sort of 5 or 10 blocks, they have a big circle in the middle and they have a monument, right? That's why it's called Monument Boulevard. And there's like, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 of these monuments. I can't remember. But you go down the boulevard and there's, I mean, bigger than life size, huge statues. Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, P.T. Beauregard. Every one of these people was a leader of the Confederacy, right? Now this is in Richmond where this population is, at least at that time, was about half black. I don't know what it is today. So this is like maybe not the kind of statues you want, you know? But look, in one sense, and I'll say something about this statue in Washington, in Lafayette Park too, because I ran across something that people might find interesting of how you might want to deal with some of these situations. I mean, in one sense, you have this sort of argument, which some people make, that these statues are all part of our heritage, which they are, because they all occurred in the United States. And that rather than like judging each statue and saying, these are the ones we're going to tear down or not tear down, that, you know, these statues play a role of reminding the nation, the people in the nation, of things that were both good and bad in our history. And this creates the potential for useful dialogue, for useful discussion. Now, I understand that argument. And, you know, and I don't, you know, I think there's some validity in it. I don't know if I agree with it entirely. This is not giving you my view. But, you know, that's, you know, the idea that we shouldn't remove any of these statues because, you know, it's part of an ongoing dialogue and discussion as to the common heritage we all share. So you have that argument. But what I would say is maybe some of these statues are offensive. Like, for instance, one of the most egregious ones, the statue of Albert Pike, you know, in Washington, D.C., you know, one of the founders of the Ku Klux Klan. So maybe some of these statues should be torn down. But, you know, obviously, if you're going to do that, it has to be done through lawful means, you know, through an application and an argument and a reasoned discussion as to whether or not some of these statues should be removed. The problem we're in today now is because of this, I mean, this culture that's been created, this identity politics. Look, identity politics, you know, dividing people into races and ethnic groups and sexes and quasi-sexes and all kinds of things. I mean, you realize this is like what the Nazis did, you know? They said, well, we're Germans, and these people are Jews.
and we're not the same. We're completely different. There's no commonality between us. In fact, they're not even really real human beings, you know. And this division, or I talked before about Huxley and this race thing, but this identity politics that's come along, I mean, this is real racism. This is modern day racism because it denies the common human identity. It denies the common creative potential we all share. You know, the God-given nature of what it means to be human. It denies that and says, you're this race, you're that race, you're this sex, you're that sex, you're this, that, this national, you know, it's racism. That's racism. The people doing this are racists. And the and one of the problems with it is if you know, with these kind of people, if you have a democratic, rational discussion or attempt to have a democratic, rational discussion about what to do about some of these statues, you know, they would have these ridiculous criteria. You know, did he own a slave or didn't he own a slave? Did he do this or didn't he do this? Was he white? Well, if he's white, then let's tear the statue down. I mean, it's this kind of stuff, right? It's insanity. So you have to, you know, there has to be a more reasoned discussion about it. And I'll give you an example of a reasoned discussion, which is, most people are not aware of this. I mean, you have this statue which has become controversial. I guess it's in Lincoln Park. Where is it? Lafayette Park, of Lincoln freeing the slaves. And you got Lincoln there standing up, and then the slave who's sort of crouching or something with his chains are broken. And some people say, well, the slave is kneeling, shouldn't be kneeling. Other people are saying the slave is getting up, but it doesn't matter. Anyway, you know, there's this big controversy about this statue now. And as some people might know, when that statue was commissioned, Frederick Douglass gave the speech there, commissioning the statue. So, you know, he wouldn't have done that if he didn't approve of the statue. However, there were at that time some objections to the statue, and some of which were not dissimilar to what we hear today. This is like 100 years ago, or more than 100 years ago. And there were people who said, well, it shows the freed slave in a subservient position. And this was said at that time by some people. Frederick Douglass wrote a couple of letters in which he offered a suggestion. And he said, look, I honor this statue and I stand by honoring it, but I can see the legitimacy of some of the criticisms of it. I can understand the criticisms, and I think some of the criticisms are legitimate. Therefore, I want to make a proposal. And what he proposed, which was never done, is that near this statue, 2 more statues should be erected. One of General Grant, because he said Lincoln freed the slaves and Grant gave the slaves equality, the freed slaves equality. So he proposed that a statue be built of General Grant, and then he proposed that a 3rd statue be built of a freed black man, maybe black man and black woman, I don't know, but a freed slave standing up, proud, and demonstrating their equality and freedom. And he said, why don't we add those 2 statues, and that'll make the picture complete. The freeing of the slave, the equality of the slave, and the slave as a freed man, proud freed man. Now, that's a reasoned proposal. And that's what we don't see today. We don't see people willing to engage in that kind of a discussion, because most of these people don't even know what slavery means. It's just a slogan. So anyway, that's what I would say.
Good, all right, Paul Glumas.
Okay, it's interesting you mentioned Grant, because that was what I was going to mention. In the reading of Grant's memoirs, in the beginning, where he's talking about being in the Mexican War, he comments that this war was an unjust war to expand the slave system And for doing this war, we paid the price with the Civil War. And I think that also adds to to what you were saying.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't have anything to say on that. I think you're absolutely right. Grant was one of the greatest presidents in American history. And it's incredible that somewhere they tore down one of his statues. San Francisco. This is a guy who when the war ended in 1865, he was the commander of the US Army. And and the South was under military occupation. So he was responsible for that military occupation from 1865 to 1869. And then in 1869, he became the president for 8 years. So we're talking about 13 years, really. And during that 13 years, he waged a heroic fight for equality throughout the South. This is when you got majority Black legislatures, governors, senators, representatives, schools, other educational facilities. The right to vote was, emphatically endorsed. And to a large extent, Grant was responsible for that. A truly great president. So anyway, next question.
Ned Nergy.
Good afternoon, Bob.
Jim Reed from Detroit, Inkster, Michigan. Perhaps after.
Tom, you'll take this question next.
We'll take your question next.
From Michigan.
From Michigan. There was one person before you. If you could just hold on.
Yeah, Bob, this is Ned. Thank you so much for your report on your paper, but I would maybe frame it.
You got to get in the center of the
bit larger than that. In that,
Hey, Ned, we can't hear you. Can you put yourself in the center of the screen and speak up? It's even worse now.
I've known you personally since 1970.
Okay, we're gonna have to. I had to mute Ned. Ned, for some reason, I don't understand what's happening here. Hey, Ned, your question is not coming through. There's some kind of problem.
Can you hear me now?
No, it's still very problematic. So, you're still kind of very distant, and there's a computer problem or an internet connection problem. Maybe you can go downstairs and use Mindy's computer, and we can take the question from Michigan.
Yeah. Want to run downstairs and get on Mindy's computer, Ned? All right, let's take the question from Michigan, okay?
What? Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah. Yes. I think I want to first say that it was such a great discussion and presentation with historical information that many are not aware of. But my comment really is, after the Revolutionary War, should we put up statues of generals from England all over America? Should we do that?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, look, the argument, I'm not defending keeping statues of Confederate generals. I wouldn't be disappointed or sorry if these statues all eventually were removed. The argument that's made, and I'm not saying this is my argument, but the argument that's made is that we have a common heritage, a common nation, a culture, which includes white, black, Hispanic, now today, Chinese, Vietnamese, Arab, people from all over the world, Indians. You know, it is, whether people want to deny it or not, it is a melting pot culture based on the principles that the country was founded on. And you know, within that 250 years, there have been a lot of good things and there have been some bad things. And you know, the argument that's made is, okay, you've got some statues that honor things that are maybe shouldn't be honored, but you know what you're creating is the basis for discussion and dialogue about the future, about the real heritage and the real history of the United States. Now, in my view, if such a discussion took place and people really began to examine the true history of the United States and the principles that created the United States, and even from there going back further into Europe, into the Renaissance, and the whole fight, you know, for creating a truly human society, anti-oligarchical society, I think such a discussion would be welcome. But in terms of this question of the statue of British soldiers, they're not part of our culture. You know, they're not. We revolted against that. You know, this is, you draw a line in the sand and you say, we fought for freedom from the British monarchy. So why in the world would we put up statues of people we fought for freedom, we fought against? I mean, if you want to make the argument that, well, we fought to end slavery against the Confederacy, therefore the Confederate statue should be removed. I mean, I can't argue with that, but I think, you know, what we don't want to do is we don't want to just turn this into a race thing. I mean, really, when I said earlier, I would not give an inch on any of this. This mealy-mouthed, oh, I've got to apologize for slavery, I got to genuflect and take the knee like Nancy Pelosi. What garbage, what absolute despicable, you know, behavior. We're fighting for what this country actually is and what it was created to be and what it needs to be today. And we're in a life and death fight. And that is the battle. And we not only have nothing to apologize for, we should be proud and honored in what we're doing in trying to win this fight today. So, you know, you start getting into, well, should we have this statue or should we have that statue or should we? I mean, I would just say, let the city councils decide. They can vote on whatever they want to. Look, this question of sculpture and statues, we should have statues honoring great people. But if you go into any major city today, whether it's New York or Chicago or Philadelphia or San Francisco or Detroit, have you taken a good hard look at the modern sculpture they put up in these cities, in the parks, in front of city halls? This stuff they erect and they spend millions of dollars on is sculpture. I mean, it's almost universally garbage, you know, and just hurts your mind looking at it. So why don't we remove some of that, you know? I don't think the statue thing is, it should be decided democratically by the appropriate elected bodies, you know? But it's not really what this fight is about. So anyway, that's how I answer your question.
Yeah, good. Is Ned available?
I hope so. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, Bob, thanks. And thank you for the presentation. Thank you for your original writing of the paper. Thank you for your writings over the recent years. Your papers have been remarkable in many lights, and yes, they've caused some arguments and fights within the organization, and I think that's good. What you've exposed around Henry Clay has been bold and apparently has substantial history behind your argument. Thank you for having the guts to bring it forward. I've known you since about 1994, and you've always been a bookworm, and I appreciate being able to appreciate all that you've learned or have access to all that you've discovered in your readings without having to directly read it all. Thank you very much.
At least you call me a bookworm and not an egghead. So go ahead. Go ahead, Ned.
Yeah, I think the entire argument that you've reflected here, you authored or you stated the author maybe in its kernel to be Nicholas of Cusa in one of his two main works, where he speaks of man in the image of God and with the power of reason. And then that same thought echoed by John Robinson, who's responsible for the Pilgrims, quote, quote, Pilgrims, and the expedition then to the US Eastern Seaboard. I think this is the axiom upon which all of the later renditions and assertions and declarations have been based on. And I think it's important that you reinstate that axiom now. And I think we should, as an organization, echo your restatement of that. And if we defend that, all of the other secondary or tertiary arguments in the specific moment about the specific event can universally be justified. So I would encourage us as an organization to defend that which is human in us all in a more universal dialogue, which I think you've done excellently here. So thank you for that. And may we all act as the future requires us to participate. Thank you.
All right. Well, look, let me say two things. One is, yeah, the American Revolution and everything great surrounding it certainly comes out of the Florentine Renaissance. And as that Renaissance radiated to other parts of Europe and eventually into the voyages of discovery. But this has to be appreciated. You have to understand that, which most people don't understand it. Most people in society. But Cusa was in a situation, not identical by any means, but sort of similar to Plato. I mean, one could argue that, one could argue that much of what is in Cusa, certainly not everything, but much of what is in Cusa is earlier in Plato. But where was Plato? Where was Socrates? They were trapped within an oligarchical society. Socrates was murdered by the oligarchy, put to death. This was the reality throughout history. With the Renaissance and the leap in science and technology, and which is what shipbuilding and all of these things were, and then the voyages of discovery, the potential was created, which eventually led into the American Revolution. And this, as I said before, more than once, this created the potential to free mankind from slavery. And that's what's important. But look, I want to just make a certain political point too, because
I'm not just, I'm not just giving this presentation, and I didn't just write this article, to say, to attack these people who are tearing down statues or rioting, or to make a certain point about race and racism, or even a more profound point about the United States and the intention and idea of the American Republic. The fact is we're in a fight now, today. Part of that fight is the impeachment of Trump. But also it's a fight to return America to these kind of principles because of the role that America has to play in the world now. Now, look, I'll just say this, and some people might be a little bit, take a little exception with it, but we talk about a four powers agreement. We talk about a new Bretton Woods system. We can talk about a new paradigm. None of these things are in any way, shape, or form possible without the United States. Anyone who thinks, well, we can get China together with India, with Russia, maybe some countries from Africa, that won't work. You're up against the British Empire. For us to resolve this crisis we're in today, and to move forward into the future, the United States of America must play a leading role. Not a singular leadership role, but a leading role, in this transformation which has to occur. And when I hear people saying, well, the United States is finished, we've already lost the United States. First of all, I really get angry when I hear that. But secondly, I scratch my head and I wonder what these people are thinking. Because if you accept the view that the United States is finished and bad and is only an evil force in the world, then whether you know it or not, you're basically saying our fight is hopeless, that we can't win. I don't believe that's true. I don't believe that's true. Our fight is, we have a president, we have a possibility here, we have good people doing good things elsewhere in the world. We have this recent initiative by Putin. We're in a fight, and we've got to bring the United States into a role, working with other countries, where we are resolving this crisis in the way it needs to be resolved. And I think we can do that. But we're not going to do it if we're running around scared of these terrorists and other lunatics who are trying to deny everything the country was created for. So I just thought I'd throw that in. Okay. Any more questions or discussion?
We have about 10 minutes, so.
10 minutes, folks. Anything else?
Yeah, Bob, it's Gerald. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Gerald.
All right. So I'm going to throw a knuckleball into this. Or maybe it's a curveball. I don't know which kind it is, but
it's not a spitball, Gerald.
No, not a spitball. I've been having some discussions with one of the other people on the call here from the Long Beach area. And because Boris Johnson came out with this discussion about FDR, this kind of highlighted it. And the question of how Britain moved into this, you said earlier about drug trade, slave trade was not financially good, how Britain moved to Asia, to Australia, to China, to India, after they lost America. In other words, they always looked at it as a worldwide thing, not just a local US, British thing. And so, funny thing about Boris Johnson, if this conference of Putin goes forward, actually 2 of the 5 presidents that are there, that is the P5 meeting, were born in New York City. Trump and Boris Johnson was actually born in New York. His father was at Columbia University. And Boris is a classics scholar who can recite, Prometheus, which he did at the UN and other things. But so my question is, how does this whole initiation of this, it's like the people who want to kill, Bertrand Russell wants to kill millions and billions, but he's going to tell you Black Lives Matter to get you all flustered and bullshitted, because the whole point is the global fight for this, what you're bringing up, versus looking at it from any lesser view of the situation. That's my question. How can we use this knowledge to further the 5 powers or 4 powers, for the future, bring it into the fight right now?
I'm not sure I understand the question. This knowledge of what Boris Johnson is doing?
No, the knowledge of what you brought out about how this whole fucking slave bullshit is being used by the people who are promoting genocide and suckering, people into fighting over things that they should be united for this future rather than divided, around. None of these people lifted a finger when we were going after the Pike statue back in the 1990s. They were like silent as could be, so why should we listen to a freaking word they say when they haven't done diddly squats about the real fight? That's my question.
Yeah, well, we shouldn't listen to anything they say. I mean, like these people, who knows who's pulling the strings on all of this? Antifa and all of these groups, whoever else. Maybe in fact that they're now arresting hundreds of them or dozens of them. Maybe some of this stuff will get actually documented on who's financing who and who's calling the shots. But this is an operation. I mean, look, this is a very carefully designed operation. I don't know what to say. I mean, look, I think to the extent to which, first of all, we clear a lot of the lies out of the way, and people recognize, what our fight really is, and potentially create a discussion about what the role of the United States, what the nature of the United States has been, and how that impacts what we should be doing today. I think that's a useful discussion. Otherwise, you mentioned Boris Johnson and Putin. I mean, look, this thing that Boris Johnson has brought up about FDR, and as I think you're aware, Putin has also discussed FDR a number of times in very glowing terms. And FDR really is, the most immediate, recent, example or someone to look to recognize the intention of the United States of America. And obviously you've got all of FDR's policies, his economic and other policies, his anti-colonial policies, and the extent to which we could generate a real discussion about FDR and the need for an FDR solution to this crisis. I think that would have very beneficial impact. Whatever occurs with the Boris Johnson thing, I believe the mere fact that he's raised this and said, we need to go to FDR, we need to have an FDR solution, whatever he means by that and whatever is going to occur because of it, the mere fact that he's raised FDR as the model to get out of this crisis, don't you think Donald Trump is reading that? Don't you think other people are reading that? This is going to have reverberations. And I would just say, we have to resituate the debate and the discussion. And clearly we need an international solution to this crisis. But the approach to that solution, the intention of what you want to create, the intention of where you're going and what you want to try to do, a lot of this is to be found in the history of the United States. And that's lawful, not because we're genetically better people, but because we were a nation created exactly for that purpose. I mean, there's a reason why John Quincy Adams said a community of principal nations. There's a reason for all of these things. This has been our mission from the beginning, to help free mankind and this is, you know, Roosevelt lecturing Winston Churchill on freeing the British colonies. This has been our purpose all along. You know, we just need to return to it. So anyway, is there more or is that it?
Bring us home.
Well, folks, I'm talked out. I have no profound closing comments. I hope people enjoyed this. I hope you got something out of it. I consider it a useful discussion, and we should celebrate the 4th of July and honor the 4th of July. And I'm really happy to have been here today with all of you. So that's what I have to say. Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay, so that's it. We'll have a recording of this posted some way, and whoever you found out about the class from, we'll try to get it to you, share it, post it. Let's get a discussion of these ideas. Thank you, Bob, for doing this today. Thanks for writing the paper. Thanks for participating, all of you, on the 4th of July.
I didn't show the Mayflower, did I?
And
oh yeah, let me do this. I didn't do this.
Here's the encore.
Yeah, this is the encore, folks, for those who haven't hung up. You got it?
Oh, you gotta get up there. You go. You gotta pull it back a little bit.
Go up.
There you go.
This is the Mayflower, folks. This is not the real Mayflower, but this is the Mayflower, a model of it, 100 feet by 24 feet. They were in this little tiny hold, you know, only 1,200 feet square, and that's how they got to America. So that's it.